start with the caveat that you'll be hearing from the two experts on campaign finance after me. I happen to make a long career as a political reporter covering campaigns for president and Congress, but never getting into the nitty-gritty of the campaign finance legislation. And I happily left that to others at our shop to do. And so what I'll talk about in the next few minutes is basically my impressions of the effects of money on our political scene, particularly on races for president and Congress. In talking with Drew Lanier about this particular panel, I asked him, well, what should I really talk about here? And he said, well, you know, take it along the lines of the topic, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and have some fun with it. And so I will take him up on that. And I'll start with my thoughts on what are good about the present system of campaign finance at the moment. One is that I don't think the cost of American politics is that high at this point, whether it's $4 billion or $8 billion, and I've heard both figures mentioned today. I mean, when you compare it to say, a lot of other things, Super Bowl advertising, as one of the speakers this morning said, toothpaste, things like that, it's a drop in the bucket. And we happen to have, just within a few miles of where I live in Northern Virginia, near Washington, D.C., there's this big new interchange being made that connects I-95 with the Beltway. I mean, it's been in the works for years. And this thing, which has, lanes going 100 feet up in the air and what have you and all, I mean, the price tag in that is already up in the vicinity of $1 billion. So if you figure that the cost of American politics, the whole election last year was a couple of highway interchanges, then I don't think that's so bad. The second thing is that there's really accessibility for everybody in terms of participating with a contribution in the process. I mean, Howard Dean showed us that you can just give a few bucks over the internet. And George Soros showed us if you have a couple $1 million lying around, you can also just give to a 527 advocacy group. Any range of money is accepted. You can participate with your campaign contribution. Also, there's a diversity of campaign finance rules in the country. I mean, there's the states. Each of the states have their own rules in terms of getting elected to the state legislature or governor. And in Washington, Congress has a set of rules for campaign finance and for being elected president. There's another set of rules, and those set of rules pertain to the nominating process and to the general election. So basically, we have all of these laboratories to experiment with campaign finance going on around the country. We can see what works, what doesn't work, and it can be applied accordingly if one wants to apply it. So we're not stuck with one universal system that is in place everywhere. There are a lot of different systems of campaign finance. And I'd say last as a good is that it's a constantly evolving process. So, I mean, much of the talk this morning was about McCain-Feingold and the strengths and failures of that and how that is likely to be modified or changed in the next election cycle or two. So that by 2008, we might have something entirely different, or not entirely different, but at least partially different than what we're discussing today. It's a constantly evolving process. Now, of course, now the fun part, which is bad. And I'd start with the question, is the money well spent, that's being spent in American politics these days? And I have my doubts that it is. I'm just, as a casual viewer of television in Northern Virginia last year, what I saw was a lot of repetitive ads that after seeing them 2 or 3 times, I first grew numb to, and then after a while, I grew angry at them, and I felt more like voting for whoever was being criticized. I think it had the opposite effect on me that it was intended to have. And I think in the nation as a whole, I don't know how the rest of the nation was reacting, but I don't know how many votes were moved, by all of this advertising that, the money is raised for. The next thing that really occurred to me that most of the country was ignored in terms of the TV campaign. We only had about 18 battleground states or so that you had most of the country being ignored and about a third of the country being battered, by all of this advertising. And you would speak better to what it was like living here in Florida. I can't even imagine what the advertising was like that you folks had to endure throughout 2004 and what this did to you. I'd be kind of interested in your response, as to how this affected you and your vote in the 2004 election. But it's interesting that in the end, once we hit election day, there are only 3 states that changed from one column to another in the presidential race. Iowa and New Mexico falling to President Bush, and New Hampshire switching to Kerry. And all of these states had been close in 2000, and they were close again in 2004. And then, and you look at the battleground state of Ohio, which was presumably our ground zero last year of the presidential race. They have 88 counties, and only 2 of those switched from one party to the other after all the millions of dollars that were dumped into Ohio. 86 of the counties voted the same way they had voted in 2000. I think if you look at I will make these comments about the finance system just from somebody who's covering campaigns. One, I think that our method of financing the presidential race is something of a mess. We have the 527s, which were alluded to, the unexpected outgrowth of McCain-Feingold, but the financing for the presidential nominating stage of the process, which is, like it or not, folks, where we are now for campaign 2000. We're at the beginning of the nominating process for 2008, which will go on for the next 3 years. But we're in the first stages of that, and this system is essentially broken. It's a system of partial public financing, matching federal funds. But in 2000, George Bush opted out of it, went on to win the nomination. In 2004, George Bush, John Kerry, and Howard Dean opted out. Kerry and Bush went on to win their nominations, and there's a widespread feeling that nobody who feels they have any chance of winning the nomination in 2008 is going to opt into the public financing system the way it's currently structured. There's going to have to be some significant changes there to entice people back in to participating in the public financing system. And then there's Congress, which is basically following the more older rules of private financing, that system tends to be skewed to incumbents. Now, I think if you look at 2004, it was a situation, it was a very pro-incumbent year. I think in no small part because of the campaign finance laws that we have. We had a president reelected, we had 25 of 26 incumbent senators reelected, and we had basically all but 7 of nearly 400 House incumbents reelected. I mean, that's about as close to unanimity as you can get. Now, why was this the case? I think in terms of money, it's not that challengers can't raise a lot of money, but it's the fact that generally an incumbent has a long head start on them. They can have $1 million or more in the bank, by the time an election year begins, and somebody's going to challenge them, still has a primary to go through. And in Congress, there's the additional problem of the lines and the way they have been drawn. Like they say, that this is the one area of politics where the members pick their voters. So you have that with the fundraising advantage that most House incumbents have, and you have a situation where not only do few incumbents lose, but few incumbents are even seriously threatened anymore. And Florida here is Exhibit A to that. If you look at the 2004 election results, none of the 25 House members lost. None of the 25 members who won House seats were elected with less than 55% of the vote, which is generally what you consider to be a marginal seat or one that is competitive. 11 of your 25 were elected without major party opposition last November. That's getting up close to half. And that includes about a half dozen who didn't have any opposition in the primary as well. And that's, well, and I must say that includes 2 of the 3 people who were on the congressional panel this morning, but I will not name names as to who they were, but they could, it was not a very democratic situation, small d. But not to pick on Florida, I mean, the nation as a whole was not much better. We had roughly 60 members of Congress elected last fall who had no major party opposition, compared to barely half that, about 30 who had competitive races. And if you put it another way, that means about 1 out of every 15 members of the current House of Representatives had a competitive race. 14 out of 15 did not. I mean, banana republics have better rates than that. So I think there are some problems here that, the current finance system has not helped in terms of competition. This gets into the last point, the ugly. And I will wrap it up very quickly, and that's that you can see problems, but good answers are not always easy to come by because we have that old law of unintended consequences come into play that basically, I guess another way you could put it, no good deed goes unpunished. Because when you're trying to change the legislation to accomplish one thing, often something else happens because there are a number of factors in play. It's not happening, you're not making changes in a vacuum. You're generally making changes that are affected by other things, like, say, the role of the media or the type of challenger that you had or their base of support or the party support that they have and things like that. There's a lot of forces going into play, and as we know, the 527s kind of came out of, is the example of an unintended consequence of the McCain-Feingold legislation. But I'll just wrap up by saying that I hope that whatever Congress does, in the next few years to try to make changes in the presidential system or in the 527s, that what they will do will enhance competition, because I think that is a major casualty of the way campaigns are funded today. So I will keep it back.
I couldn't help but comment on the last speaker, the good senator from Florida, who might have left you with the feeling that the filibuster rule was part of the United States Constitution. It is not. The Constitution provides that each body of the Congress will make its own rules. Therefore, the filibuster rule is a rule of the caucuses in the United States Senate, so it can be changed by the Senate as they so choose. So just in case you thought there was a checks and balances and that the filibuster was part of that checks and balances as provided in the Constitution, that would not be true. Secondly, I'd like to talk from here, because I've been here all morning and I've been taking lots and lots of notes about things that I heard said that were true and some things that were of questionable value. Let me start off by giving you sort of this overview. That's right, I represent special interests, and I'm very proud of that. We live in a representative democracy, as Senator Nelson said, and in a representative democracy, the key here is that people should support folks who represent their point of view, thus the word representative democracy. And since the beginning of our country, the participation, the political participation of special interests has been encouraged. It is as noble a participation as it is a necessary participation. As an example, if it was not for the assistance of the business community of Alexandria, Virginia, helping a cash-strapped George Washington in 1757 run for the House of Burgesses for the first time, he probably would not have been the first president of the United States. Therefore, it is inherent in a representative democracy that people get together, fund and support candidates who support their way of thinking. It just so happens that we have a multitude of different special interests, whether it's an environmental group, whether it's the veterans, whether it's a student group, whether it's business, whether it's a specific industry. But that's the way it's supposed to work. We've decided in our country that an educated electorate must understand where people stand on the issues in order to determine whether that person is representing their point of view. We've also decided in this country that the way we will conduct that education is through campaigns. And campaigns are the way in which the candidates or special interests bring their point of view to the public's attention. Is it always pretty? No. But it sure as hell beats whatever's in second place. Now we talk about the cost of campaigns. I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with money in politics. We talk about campaign finance reform as saying, well, it's to reduce the amount of money in politics. Why? What we want to do is reduce the improper use of money or the corrupting influence of money. We don't really want to reduce the amount of money in politics. I mean, this is the exercise of one of the most cherished parts of being an American, is to participate and have open campaigns. Talk about how much money is in campaigns. Anywhere from $4 billion to $8 billion was spent in the 2004 elections across the board. You got to put that in perspective. That's still not as much as we spent on video games last year. It's about the same amount of money we spent on chewing gum and other snacks last year. So is it too much to ask that the very essence of our republic is supported at the same level that we support video games? I don't think so. Now, Senator Nelson talked about the escalating cost. Yes, it is more expensive to run a campaign today than it was in 1972 when he first ran for Congress. But let's just look at the numbers involved with that. He ran in 1972 and he said it cost him about $200,000. In 1972, a Chevy cost about $2,500. In 2002, a Chevy cost about $20,000. Okay, so it's 8 times more expensive than it was in 1972. If he ran for Congress in 1972, it cost him $200,000. It's 8 times more expensive today. It cost him $1.6 million. There are 25 congressional districts in the state of Florida, so running for the Senate state of Florida using his numbers would cost $40 million. He says he can do it for 18. That's a heck of a deal. My point is that in the ensuing years, the nature of campaigning has changed, just as it has since the beginning of our republic. Back in the mid-1800s, it was whistle stops, and everybody would go around, and a train would come into town, and you'd go listen to people talk from the back of the train. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. Not very many of you are going to go stand at the back of the train. In fact, we are getting our messages in totally different ways than we did even 15 years ago. Somebody mentioned today, now, we have hundreds of television stations. We don't have 4 anymore. We have hundreds of television stations, and they appeal to slivers of people all across the country, different attitudes. So in order to be effective on television, and I would question whether television is effective, you have to be on a multiplicity of stations. But in 2004, we began to see something else happening, and it's indicative of the way you live your lives. You live your lives differently than did your parents or did your grandparents. In 2004, 21% of all the people who ended up voting said the primary source of their political information came from the internet. It just so happens that that's greater than any national television network. So we have a whole different way of campaigning beginning to occur. Now, the title of this symposium are Elections for Sale. I would suggest to you that if elections are for sale, no one's getting what they paid for. Let me explain why. In politics has been described, there are 2 pots of money. There's hard dollars and there's soft dollars. These are the dollars that come from individuals or from political action committees. It was created under the federal election campaign laws in the 1970s. These hard dollars are clearly regulated and they're capped. Now, what the campaign finance reform did was recognize that this system works. So they recognized it and institutionalized this system of financing campaigns because they said it works. This is 75% of the money in campaigns. What we're talking about here is the soft money, the unregulated money, the money in any amounts which is not as clearly regulated as this hard money. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about 25% max of the amount of money that's in campaigns. And for the most part, this doesn't affect most campaigns, soft money. High-profile Senate and House races, some state party races, but for the most part, this is relegated to high-impact races and presidential races. Okay, now let's look what happened in 2004 and why I say, when we ask about campaigns being bought and sold, why it doesn't really apply anymore. In 2002, Democrats and Democratic-leaning groups spent $321 million on 527 activities. I'll explain 527s in a minute. If I don't, Phil, make me do that. And Democrats spent 321, Republicans spent 84. Republicans clearly won the election of 2004, but they got outspent 4-1. So if somebody was buying a campaign, they missed the deal here. I represent American business. We got outspent by organized labor $112 million to $30 million. But clearly this is one of the bigger elections for American business. So if you're thinking that just simply having money in an election these days is sufficient to buy an election, obviously it's not. Now let's talk about campaign finance reform, the good, bad, and the ugly. The good thing about campaign finance reform is, as Rhodes was talking about, unintended consequences. They institutionalized political action committee, and they institutionalized the concept of hard money in politics. They institutionalized it to the degree that they actually index the amount an individual can give to inflation, so that now this amount can maintain itself as the economy grows. That's the good thing. The bad thing is that in their attempt to root out corruption as perceived as it comes to sham ads, and basically when you boil it all right down to it, what campaign finance reform this time is about, and he'll probably disagree, was we had these ads being run by folks whose names didn't mean anything and no one knew where their money come from, and particularly that these ads were being run against incumbents. So campaign finance reform was focused on trying to do away with those sham ads by those folks who would abuse the 527 part of the Internal Revenue Code. The bad thing was, on the way towards trying to root out the perception of corruption, they stomped on everybody's First Amendment rights. My question has always been, since when do we stomp on everybody's rights to get at the guilty few, when it is in America where we say, we actually will wait till someone is proven guilty before we try to take away their rights? I think this is the wrong way to go about that. If we have a problem with the perception of corruption, what we should do is pass laws that go after those who violate the law, not punish those who don't in an attempt to throw a net big enough to catch them all. This goes back to something that has been talked about 2 or 3 times today, and that is the complication of these laws allows folks who would do illegal things a place to hide. The more complicated the law, the less willing people are to participate, the less likely they are to understand the law, which brings me to the ugly. And I wanted some help with this. All right, you wonder what this is. Inside the law, the Supreme Court ruled in Buckley versus Vallejo, somebody referenced earlier, that it was okay for the government to step on people's First Amendment rights and limit the amount of money that you can give to a candidate because if you don't, it shows that there's a perception of corruption. And so what the court said was, we will allow $2,000 to be the top limit because any more than that, and it appears there's been some corruption. All right. So what they did in McCain-Feingold was said, well, that's okay, but what if I'm running against a really wealthy candidate? And the candidate's going to spend his own money. I should be able to adjust the amount of money that I get if I'm running against a wealthy candidate. This became the Millionaires' Amendment. So they have a sliding scale of the perception of corruption. And this is in the law. Here it is. Threshold is the amount at which the new calculation amount kicks in. Now, you all run for Congress, so you have to understand this. You have 0.04 times the voting age population plus 150,000 over the amount available on these 2 dates preceding an election year times 0.50 times the general receipts minus the personal fund. If you qualify for that, you've hit the threshold. Then, if that threshold of personal funds as defined in Section 304 of the Act is less than 2 times the allowable limit, then you only get to accept $2,000 as indexed for inflation. But if you run against a candidate and their personal funds is greater than 1.99 but still less than 4 times the threshold up here, then you get 3 times the allowable limit over 2,000 as adjusted for inflation. And it gets more complicated from there. Now, this is the kind of thing, I think we've made our points. This is the kind of thing that fills up hundreds of pages in our campaign finance laws. These are not laws that are written to make entry into or participation in the political process easier. They're not made to make it more pervasive. They're not made to protect anybody but incumbents. What we really need to do and you've heard this before, and we really go to the core of what the problem is, if there's a problem in campaign financing, and that is rooting out the bad guys, is we need to go to a system of fair and open transparency. Works this way. If you give money to a candidate or an advocacy group, it has to be reported electronically within 48 hours. End of story. You don't do it, you're in deep trouble. There is no other alternative. That's what we need to do. We make it clear. What does that mean? If you're running for Congress in the state of Iowa, and the corn growers of Iowa want to give you $500,000, let them give it to you. You just have to report it so that the people of Iowa who are involved in that election can determine whether or not that candidate is corrupt or not. The more we try to take the decision away from the people who are electing the candidates, the less participation we're going to get in the elections. One last comment about that. One last comment. In 2004, we had 17 million more people vote than we did in 2000. 13 million of those people voted for the first time. What's happening in America is that politics is being taken away from television contracts, being taken away from consultants, and it's being played as a grassroots game. Rather than seeing politics beginning, the election beginning to, or turnout beginning to go down, it's beginning to go up. And it's beginning to go up because people are getting back in politics. And if my message is anything, it is this: if you allow the people to make the decisions about how politics will be run in this country, and not make it so complicated that they have to have an attorney, you will continue to see better participation in the American political process. It is when you make all these smokescreens that people get confused that the process becomes under the control of only the campaign professionals.
I've been working in this field for about 25 years, and as Congress's policy expert on the campaign finance system, I mean, I have been there since 1979 when the last time we had amended the federal election laws, right through the McCain-Feingold. It was like a 20-something year period, and I observed quite a bit of change over the last 25 years, and you know, probably the principal one is what we considered good and what we considered bad has changed over that time, and what has propelled the quote-unquote reformers. And I want to define when I say reformers, because reform is a loaded word. A reformer, I mean, someone who labels himself as a reformer, I mean, that is open to all different interpretations. When I use the term reform in the campaign finance field, I'm talking about people who are generally inclined to want to regulate more, as opposed to Greg Casey, who you just heard from, who is an example of someone who's at the other side, who wants to regulate less. In fact, the less regulation, the better. And it's what I've called sort of the free market approach to the campaign finance system. Have disclosure, but no other restrictions, and let the people decide. The reformers, whether the issue was PACs in the 1980s, or soft money, or 527s now, the reformers bent what have been labeled as the reformers, and who we now identify as the John McCain, Russ Feingold types. Their impulse has generally been for more law, more regulation to monitor the flow of money in our elections. Back in the 70s, and the 70s was a critical time because the Watergate scandal of the early 70s had left, among the conclusions that people drew was, well, one of the problems with Watergate was that there was too much money, and that's why they got into trouble, because they had too much money on their hands, and that got them into spending it in ways that was not healthy for the political system. But the whole notion that there were too much money and too much interested money were perceived since the 70s, and the people who picked up the mantle after the major legislation of the 1970s, that was their focus. Those were the primary evils: too much money generally, and too much interested money specifically. And hence their focus through the 80s, through much of the 90s, was political action committees as the representatives of the special interests, and the large amounts of money that were being spent by candidates. Now, also, they came to recognize during those couple of decades that there were some other problems, but decidedly less important, and those were the avenues that were developing by people, presumably and most likely in response to the regulation that existed, of finding other ways to spend the money in the political system. Early on, it was something known as independent expenditures was considered rather disturbing, because this was money that could be spent without regard to the contribution limits and spending limits that might otherwise be in place, because the group was independent and not legally connected to any candidate. And then growing through the 1980s was the concern about soft money. But again, these concerns were very secondary. The focus of what was considered the reformers in the 1980s, in most of the 1990s, was promoting limits on spending by congressional candidates, coupled with some kind of public benefits, either public subsidies directly or ways to reduce the costs of media time, postal time, etc., and either curbs, if not outright prohibition on political action committee money. Curbing the bad money and enhancing what was seen as the good money in the political system. In 1996, there was just a sea change in emphasis, in a shift in emphasis on what propelled the reformers to move forward in terms of the legislative avenues that they were pursuing. From the general concern about the amounts that were being spent and the particular sources of the money, post-96, when everything came, the world was turned upside down in the 1996 elections, they developed a much more narrow focus, not on just the total amounts being spent and the large amounts from particular sources, but they began to fine-tune their approach to finding that what they referred to as the nexus of wealthy, of large donations and being raised by federal officials, by politicians, and by party officials. That they zeroed in on that as their emphasis, really, in how they shaped the legislation. The McCain-Feingold bill that was enacted in 2002 was very, very different from the McCain-Feingold bill that existed just prior to the 96 elections. And the 96 elections, remember, is when the issue advocacy phenomena burst on the scene, and it's when people realized that, the soft money thing that we were seeing develop in the 80s and into the 90s has now virtually overtaken what we had been concerned about, has overtaken the regulatory system that we've had in place. And from a peripheral focus on issues like accountability, I think that became almost their primary focus. The last McCain-Feingold bill, the version prior to the 96 election, included limits on campaign spending by candidates for Congress, some form of public benefits, and a curb, if not an actual prohibition on PAC money. 1 year later, in 1 year's time, those elements were completely removed from the McCain-Feingold bill, and their focus was twofold: soft money, and again, there too, it was eliminating the opportunity for corruption stemming from large donations being raised by people in a position of power. And secondly, the whole question of trying to bring the issue advocacy activities under the federal regulatory system. And the interest was accountability, making sure that everyone was playing by the same rules. That was their focus. And ironically, post-96, people looked at political action committees and said, why did we think they were bad? The amounts they give are capped. It's fully disclosed. There is no opportunity for any one of those entities to amass too much power in the political system. And I think on the whole major question of too much money, I think there's almost been a change on the part of the pro-regulation forces to almost an acceptance of the reality that in our elections we are going to spend a lot of money. No matter how you try to clamp it down here, the money will spring up here. I have sensed an acceptance of this as almost a political reality. And I think what we have seen, and what we're certainly seeing now with the concern about the 527s is almost a sense that what is really of greater concern to us is that the money be disclosed and be accountable. Because after the 2004 elections, I mean, how many times people said to me, well, I thought McCain-Feingold was supposed to do something about all this, and look what we had in last year. We had all these hundreds of millions being spent by these outside groups, and people didn't know who they were, and were they really connected with the campaign? Were they throwing mud? Was it in some kind of organized strategy, but to avoid the candidate they were trying to help, getting burned by it? So I think the focus of what has been considered bad versus good has changed over time. I think it will continue to change. Our focus now is the 527s, but once the 527s are dealt with, if they're dealt with, and I believe they will be to some extent in this Congress, they're going to be looking at the 501c groups, the other kinds of tax-exempt groups that are also have opportunities to be involved in politics and have an impact, albeit less directly, on elections. So Congress still has work to do, but Congress is also still suffering from campaign finance fatigue from having gone through the McCain-Feingold debate of 7 years leading up to 2002. So I'm not really sure how much stomach Congress has to get into all this again, but I think as issues like the 527 one come up and cause a whole lot of debate and controversy, they are going to have to step back up and figure out what to do. But I think the emphasis is going to be on how can we make the spending more accountable and more regulated in such a way that it is more accountable.